Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving the over 93,000 computing professionals and students who are ACM's member. I'm Will Trace, Lockheed Martin Fellow Emeritus, former chair of ACM SIGSOF, member of the ACM Professional Development Committee and the ACM SIG Governance Board. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members can stay competitive in the constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. ACM provides timely computing information published by ACM, including communications with ACM and Q magazines, access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, and international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics. Support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, the ACM Turing and ACM Prize in Computing Awards. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find a number of additional widgets and resources. If you are experiencing problems with the slides or audio, and I know some of you will, please press F5 key in your Windows command or Command plus R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser on a mobile device, or you can close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at any time during the webinar and click the Submit button. I'll organize the questions as Professor Mitchell speaks, and he'll reserve time at the end of the presentation to address them. The session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available. And check learning.acm.org for updates on this and other upcoming webcasts. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey open on your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out to help us improve our webinars. You may also open the survey at any time throughout the presentation from the menu at the bottom of your screen. You can also use Facebook and Twitter widgets at the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag #ACM Learning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a new community discourse page to continue the discussion after this webcast, including questions we won't be able to get through during the Q&A session. You should be seeing a window open in your new tab of your browser now. You can bookmark it and return to it after the presentation. Today's presentation is using machine learning to study neural representations of language meaning by Tom Mitchell. Tom is the E. Franken University professor at Carnegie Mellon University, where he founded the world's first machine learning department. His research uses machine learning to develop computers that are learning to read the web and use brain imaging to study how the human brain understands what it reads. He's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a past president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, AAAI. Tom, without further ado, take it away.
Thanks, Will, and thanks everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be able to do this webinar. I think one of the most interesting open questions in science today, really, is the question of how the brain uses neural activity to represent the things that we perceive and the things that we think about, and how our brain effectively computes on those neural representations. So what I'm going to do today, I want to focus on two questions that we've been examining now for a decade or so that are related to that. And as you'll see, I'll be focusing also on how we might use machine learning, how we can use machine learning to advance the science of cognitive neuroscience to study these questions. So the first is, how does neural activity encode word meanings? If I say to you coffee, or I say to you baseball, it's the same brain, but there are different patterns of neural activity in your head while you think about those two things. What are the nature of those patterns of neural activity? Is there a systematicity to them? Can we reliably decode from those patterns of neural activity which word you're thinking about? And then a related question is, how does the brain combine meanings of multiple words into sentences and webinar-sized chunks of meaning? So those are the two questions. And when I say we've been studying, I really mean a team of students, researchers, faculty, colleagues, most notably Marcel Just up here at the top of this slide, who's a professor in the psychology department at Carnegie Mellon, and who taught me how to do brain imaging in the first place, and a close collaborator on much of this research. So if I asked you to study this question, and I provided you with current technology for brain imaging, like functional MRI, and I asked you to set up a research program, you'd probably come up with the same basic idea as we have, which is we'll put people in the fMRI scanner and we'll record pictures of their neural activity while we show them different stimuli. Sometimes we'll show them pictures of objects like a drill or a house. Sometimes we'll show them written words. Sometimes we'll show them both a picture and a written word. But the idea is somehow we'll get them to think about some concept, and then we'll take a picture of the neural activity that we see in their brain while they perceive and think about that stimulus. So here you see, for example, the neural activity from one subject when they think about the stimulus bottle up there in the right-hand corner of the slide. And this looks like 4 images, but you have to keep in mind that fMRI images, brain activity images, are really a 3-dimensional image. And so what you're seeing here are 4 different slices of the 3-dimensional brain activity image. And just to help you get oriented, the top of the page here is the back of the head. The bottom of the page is the front, the forehead. And the thermometer down there on the right shows that those red blotches in the image correspond to high neural activity, regions with high neural activity, and you can see the color code there. So that's what we see when a person perceives the stimulus bottle. Now you might ask me, is it different if they perceive a different stimulus? So to answer that, let me show you the mean activity if we average over 60 different stimuli. And now you can see it looks kind of like the activity for bottle, but there are some differences. And in fact, I could subtract out the mean activity from the activity for bottle. And if I do, then I will get the difference between the two. And you can see that there is some activity that's a little different for bottle. So unless I say otherwise in this webinar, the analyses we're doing are on these difference images, like in the bottom of the screen here. Okay, so given that kind of data, the very first question we thought of is, well, can we train a machine learning program to decode which stimulus you're thinking about? And so we tried that. For example, We could train a classifier. This might be a support vector machine, logistic regression, a deep neural network. We've tried them all. And the idea of the classifier is that we show it training examples corresponding to one training example would be, here's a brain activity image. And in this case, the person was reading the word bottle. Here's another example where, again, they're reading the word bottle. Here's a different brain image during which time they were reading the word hammer. And so given a set of training examples like that, we then train the system to effectively learn the pattern of neural activity that distinguishes those two words, or that is representative of each, and then challenge it to classify new brain images which were not part of that training set. And if it can successfully then tell for new images, say from the same person, which of the two stimuli they were thinking about, then we know that classifier has effectively learned what is the pattern of neural activity that represents thinking about that particular stimulus. So we tried that, and indeed it works. You see here, each of these black bars corresponds to one participant in our study and shows how accurately the trained classifier for that particular person could decode which stimulus they were looking at when it was shown additional images. And in this case, the stimuli were all stimuli either about tools or about buildings. So tool words like hammer and a screwdriver, building words like house and palace. And so the classification task here is simply to determine whether they're thinking about a tool or a building. And so what you see here is quite compelling evidence that with fMRI resolution, which is about 1 millimeter spatial resolution, that sounds like really good resolution until you realize that a cubic millimeter of brain tissue contains about 50,000 neurons. So we're really nowhere near the single neuron level of imaging. But despite that, it's possible with much better than the 50% chance level of accuracy that you would get if you're just guessing, it's possible to decode which word different people are thinking about. So the importance of this is that this gives us a new tool that the neuroscientists did not have. They had this wonderful tool called fMRI that enables them for the first time to look inside our heads and see the neural activity that's there. But now we're basically giving a new tool, which is a virtual sensor. The trained classifier is a virtual sensor which turns that observed neural activity into decoded information. What is the neural activity actually encoding? And so from that perspective, we're now in a position to answer a lot of interesting questions, like, are the neural representations in your brain and mine similar? And we can turn that into the corresponding machine learning question, which I just skipped over. There. We can turn it into the corresponding machine learning question, which is, can we train classifiers on on data from one group of people, and then decode a new person's neural activity, even if they weren't part of the group of people we trained on? And of course, if the answer to that is yes, that's very compelling evidence that different people have very similar neural codes for representing word meanings. So we tried that, and the answer is absolutely yes. Here you see, again, each black bar corresponds to the accuracy of decoding the word stimulus if we train on a particular participant and test on new data from that same person. But now I've added some white bars in addition, and the white bars correspond to what if we train on zero data from this person, but instead train on the data from all the other participants in the study, and then decode, for example, on the left, and then decode the neural activity for participant P1. And what you see is that the white bars on average are about just as accurate as the black bars, meaning that we get about the same accuracy if we train on your brain and decode your brain, or the same if we train on 8 other people and then decode your brain. So this is very compelling evidence and one of the discoveries of our work that, in fact, these neural codes, whatever they are very similar across people. So now we can kind of run with that idea. We could ask, not only are the neural representations similar across people, are they similar across language? So we found some bilingual English-Portuguese subjects. We presented words in Portuguese, trained the classifier using the neural activity when they read the Portuguese words, and then found that we could equally well decode which word they were reading when we subsequently presented English words to the same people. So it works across language, which is just evidence in retrospect. What that's telling us is the neural activity doesn't really care. The neural activity is really representing the meaning of what you're thinking about, not the surface form of the letter string and things like that. In fact, we also found that we could train on words, H-A-M-M-E-R, and then decode which picture, let's say a picture of a hammer, you're looking at. Again, that's evidence that the patterns of neural activity that we're picking up are really fundamentally about the meaning of the concept and not the low-level percepts you're considering. We also found that it's easier to decode which word you're thinking about if it's a concrete noun. By concrete noun, I simply mean a noun describing a physical object you could touch, like a table or a shoe or a plant. Or emotions are also very easy. If I give you words like anxiety or love or generosity, those are easier to those are relatively easy to decode, which probably means that emotional words have very fundamental representation. Harder to decode are abstract nouns, things like democracy or justice. And verbs are hard to decode also unless you put them in context. So if I say a verb like cut, C-U-T, that's difficult to decode if we present it in isolation. But if I say person cut into line or the surgeon cut the patient, then in context the verbs are as easy to decode as the nouns. So we find a lot of things with these. We can use the ability to train classifiers to decode the information content in the neural signal as effectively a new kind of virtual sensor for studying many interesting questions. But I want to stop there and point out that that's interesting and helpful, but it doesn't really give us a theory of how the brain represents meaning. Instead, what it gives us, I could give you a list of 100 trained classifiers for 100 different words, showing you the pattern of neural activity for each, but that's just a list, a useful list, but it's not a theory. We got interested next in the question of, can we develop a theory? What would it mean to have a theory of neural representations? And if you think about it, a theory is a formal system that makes predictions about phenomena that you haven't yet seen, and then you can go off hopefully and run an experiment to test the theory. So we got interested in the question, can we build a computer theory, a computer model, that we would give it any word, let's say any noun to begin, and it would predict the neural activity when a person reads it noun. If we had such a system, that would constitute a much more fundamental understanding of neural representations than we get from simply having a list of 100 patterns of neural activity corresponding to 100 words. So we worked on this for a while, and the first successful model we built looks like this. It predicts, given an input noun like telephone, for example, an arbitrary noun, it predicts the neural activity that we will see if we give a person that word to think about. Predicts it in 2 steps. The first step is that it retrieves corpus statistics from the web, from 1 trillion words of text on the web provided by Google, thank you Google, that summarize the verbs that co-occur with this noun. And that gives us a vector representation of word meaning, which you see there in the green dots in the middle of the model. And then from that vector representation of the word meaning, we can train a system to predict the neural activity based on that vector. So let me show you in more detail what I mean by that. Here, for example, are the corpus statistics for, on the left, the noun celery. You can see it occurs a lot with the verb eat and the verb taste, but down at the bottom it doesn't occur very much with the verb ride. On the other hand, airplane, which is on the right here, you can see that occurs a lot with the verb ride and not very much at the bottom with the verb manipulate. So you can see that these corpus statistics roughly capture an operational version of the meaning of the nouns. Of course, these days, corpus statistics and vector representations, vector embeddings of word meanings are very popular and very effective across much of natural language research. And here we're using them in the service of neuroscience research. Given that that vector representation of every noun in terms of its verb co-occurrences, the second half of the model then is trained to predict the neural activity at each voxel, each point in the brain, as a weighted linear sum of contributions from each of those verbs. So down here on the bottom left, you see the prediction at voxel V, at location V in the brain, is going to be made as a linear sum over the 25 verbs that we collected statistics for, of how frequently the ith verb occurs with the input word, in this case celery, times some coefficient, C sub VI. That coefficient is trained from other data to show us how much co-occurring with the verb, the ith verb, like eat, will influence the activity at the V voxel. And so there are a lot of those C sub VI coefficients, about 500,000, and those are trained, again, using the same data that we used to train our classifier, which is pairs of noun stimuli and the corresponding brain images that we did see. But now, once we've trained this model, we can use it to make predictions for nouns for which we haven't yet collected data. And when we do that, for example, here, you can see the predicted images for the word celery and the word airplane using the model which was trained when it was trained, it never saw examples of the word celery or airplane. So it's extrapolating from other nouns it was trained on to make this prediction. See the predicted images at the top, and you see the actual, unknown to the program, observed images when we went and collected the fMRI images for those two words. And so you can see the predictions are capturing some of the structure in the neural activity, but not perfectly. But it's clearly capturing something. We can make a more quantitative analysis of how well the model works by taking pairs of words like celery and airplane, challenging the trained model when it hasn't seen those words to tell us, we give it 2 new images and 2 new words, celery and airplane in this diagram, and we ask it to tell us which one of those images is celery and which one is airplane. And of course, if it was just guessing, it would be right 50% of the time at chance. In fact, the model, when it bases this on its own predictions of what the images would look like, is substantially better than 50%. So what does this mean? What this means is it is possible to build a computational model that extrapolates beyond the nouns that it was trained on to successfully, semi-successfully, it's not 100% accurate, make predictions about the neural encodings of words that it has never seen. It's a really fundamental point, because what that means is it could have been that our brains use hash codes where every word just gets its own assigned code randomly, but that's not what's happening. The fact that this model works means there is a systematicity. There is a set of more primitive meaning components out of which the brain assembles this neural code. And in fact, in this particular model, the model is assuming there's a set of exactly 25 meaning components corresponding to those 25 verbs. We can look at what it has learned about those components. For example, the trained model believes that to the degree a noun co-occurs with the verb eat on the left, then here on the left is the pattern of neural activity that will be added in to the activity representing that noun. And similarly for the verb push and the verb run. Those black arrows on the diagram here are pointing to the biggest blotches of neural activity learned by the model for each of these verbs. And in each of those three cases, it turns out that those blotches of activity, say for the verb eat on the left, corresponds to activity in a region of the brain called, which some people call gustatory cortex, because previous studies have shown it's associated with a sense of taste. So what this means is our model has decided that if a noun co-occurs with the verb eat, it's going to generate activity in the part of the brain associated with a sense of taste, even though the model didn't know that's what that brain region does. And similarly, the verb push generates activity in somatosensory cortex, which is part of your brain associated with sensing things if you push them. And the verb run generates activity in superior temporal sulcus, which previous studies have shown are associated with perceiving motion of biological objects like people and animals. Okay, so I'm going to move on to say, so this model, the importance of this model is that it shows us that these patterns of neural activity, in fact, are built up out of more primitives. In a 2-hour webinar, I would have a lot more to say about that. But I'll simply say that since we have studied this question, we've examined quite a few different alternatives to those 25 verbs for capturing the basis set of semantic features out of which these neural activities are composed. And one of the happy outcomes of this is that the best set of features we found is actually a set of features that were learned automatically from a set of 20 subjects worth of data and using machine learning technique for learning latent representations called canonical correlation analysis. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that because our time is limited here, but I'd be happy to give some pointers to that. Instead, I want to move on to a completely different way of thinking about this problem, because so far we've been thinking about patterns of neural activity spatially distributed, but kind of ignoring the time component. When I started this work, I didn't know the answer to the question, how long does it take your brain to recognize and understand a word? The answer is about 400 milliseconds. There are a lot of reasons for justifying that. But it's not instantaneous. Now, fMRI imaging gives us a beautiful spatial resolution image, but it only gives us an image about once per second. So it's very slow compared to reading time. And so more recently, we have looked with a second brain imaging technique called magnetoencephalography, MEG imaging, which gives us not 1 second, one per image, but an image per millisecond. So now we can actually make a movie, which I will show you, of the neural activity millisecond by millisecond during the 400 milliseconds that it takes this particular person to read and understand the word. In this case, the stimulus is the word hand, along with the line drawing of the hand. So what you're going to see, you see here down in the bottom left, it says t equals minus 20 milliseconds. I'm starting 20 milliseconds before the word appears on the screen. And then the word appears on the screen, and here's the movie of brain activity over the subsequent 500 milliseconds. You see the clock down in the bottom left moving forward. But isn't that amazing? It's not a static image at all. It's highly dynamic brain activity running back and forth across your brain. That's what happens inside during the half second that it takes you to understand a word. So now the question, one interesting question becomes, using this kind of imaging, how much further can we go in terms of understanding not just the spatial distribution of neural activity revealed by fMRI, but what is the information flow in that movie? So basically, here's the question, and this became the PhD thesis topic of Gus Sudre in our group. Gus said, I want to make a movie not of the neural activity flow, the movie we just looked at. I want a movie of the information flow, of the data flow that neural activity flow represents. And so what he did was he trained approximately 1 million distinct classifiers. Each classifier looked at only a 50 millisecond time window in that movie, and only at one of 72 predefined brain regions. And it tried to predict not the whole word, but some feature of the word. And we had a list of 218 semantic features that we collected from Mechanical Turk, Amazon service, that were properties like, well, does this word describe something that's bigger than a bread box? Does it describe something that's alive? Does it describe something that you let into your house? So we had hundreds of semantic features. You can think of those as a substitute for our 25 verbs in the previous study. And Gus made the following movie. He trained his classifiers and found that from 0 to 50 milliseconds in that movie, even though he could train a lot of classifiers, none of them passed the cross-validation test to indicate that they could successfully decode any of those features in any of the brain regions. But the next 50 milliseconds, there were some perceptual features like word length, the number of characters in the word that could be decoded from neural activity. And the next 50 milliseconds more, and the next 50 milliseconds more, and the next, and so forth. So Gus built a movie of the information encoded over time at different places and different times during the 500 milliseconds that the person is taking to comprehend fully the word meaning. And you can see the amount of information decodable peaks at around 400 milliseconds. See what some of the key features are, drops back down. So it's an interesting movie, and it's an interesting way of getting at a very fundamental question, which is, what is the nature of word comprehension? What is, before seeing this movie, before Gus made this movie, we were wondering, maybe the brain looks at the word and looks at it, figures out what it is, indexes into the meaning representation, and then poof, all at one time, all of the meaning features become available in the brain. But this movie shows something very different, that the features trickle in over time, and that some of them, in fact, move around the brain. So I want to just show you a more detailed drill down on what you see if you look at the details of this movie. And I'll show it to you this way. Here's one feature that I've chosen. This one is not even a semantic feature. This is word length, the number of letters in the word. And each column in this matrix corresponds to a different brain region. There's 72 brain regions altogether. And each row here corresponds to a different 50 millisecond time window, with 0 being the time at which the stimulus is presented on the screen. And the color at the IJ component here indicates how accurately, in a cross-validated sense, the trained classifier could actually decode the number of characters in the word length, from that particular brain region and that particular 50 milliseconds. Blue means chance level, but red means high accuracy. So what you see here is very interesting, that at around 100 milliseconds, you see a bunch of red regions that indicate suddenly the neural activity codes the number of letters in the word that you're looking at. And it simultaneously does that across half a dozen different brain regions. So there's something interesting going on. Furthermore, you see that the ability of that neural activity, our ability to decode from that neural activity, the word length, persists for about 100 or 150 milliseconds, then it goes away. By the time we get to 400 milliseconds, when you understand the word, it can no longer actually decode from the neural activity what the word length was. Brain forgets it by the time it understands the word. On the other hand, if we look at a second feature, this one's semantic, like this is grasping. That is the word that you're reading describing a concept that you could grasp, like a hammer, as opposed to a cloud? And the answer here is that, again, once the red high accuracy decoding time is reached, suddenly it's again half a dozen different places in the brain that suddenly simultaneously encode that semantic feature. This one's much later, by the way. The word length decodability was at around 100 milliseconds. Graspability, which is the semantic feature, is more like 250 milliseconds after word onset. So you get the idea. So the point here is simply that using these machine learning techniques, we can, again, convert from the machine-generated pictures and data of neural activity to instead examine our own generated pictures of the information content and the data flow, basically, in the brain during word comprehension. So I want to end by presenting one more piece of work here. This is due to another recent PhD student, Layla Webby. We're interested both in single word comprehension, but also multiple words. The sentence I'm saying is mostly interesting because it has multiple words, and your brain is composing the meaning of this sentence out of its understood meanings of the individual words. So we've also been studying questions like Alana Feisch, one of our PhD students, did a thesis on what happens when people read an adjective-noun combination, like the gentle kitten versus the angry kitten. Nicole Raffiti, one of our current PhD students, is looking at sentence comprehension, and in particular active and passive voicing. So if I say, the dog ate the bone, or the bone was eaten by the dog, those two sentences mean the same thing, but the word sequence is different. So she's in her thesis looking at sentence comprehension with these kind of techniques and trying to drill down and understand the neural processing. Layla went even further. She said, well, what if we had people read Harry Potter stories? And what could we learn from that? And so I just want to show you a glimpse of her work. She presented a chapter of Harry Potter, which took 35 minutes for people to read. She presented the story one word at a time. So here you see Harry would be on the screen for 500 milliseconds. Then it would be replaced by the next word and so forth. We did it this way so that we would know exactly down to the millisecond when each word was read by the person. And then she said, well, I'm going to train a machine learning model to predict the sequence of fMRI and MEG. She used both imaging methods from the words from the story, from the words in the story. So in the case of fMRI, she got an image every 2 seconds that would correspond to 4 words. Harry had never believed we would get then one fMRI image. He would meet a, like another fMRI image, and so forth. And so she trained a model that, like the first one I talked about, that predicted for single nouns what the activity would be. She predicted the sequence of brain images from the sequence of words in the story. And now the interesting question is, what are the features we should use to characterize the state of the story at time t? And so what we decided was we would use corpus statistics, text statistics, like we had done for the single noun study where we used, say, verb co-occurrence frequencies. Here we now use more recent methods like word2vec is one of the standard, highly successful vector embeddings for words, so we use that to produce 100 features for each word. But then we also hand annotated the story, Layla and I, to annotate for each word a number of other features that were more contextual, not just related to the single word. So for example, if the passage was talking about some kind of physical motion like flying or manipulating or moving, and that might be punctual or sticky, that is, it might be that he was flying for several sentences, so that would be sticky, or it might be he just flew and landed, or he punched Bill, and that would be a punctual thing. We characterize the emotions being experienced by different characters in the story. We characterized, you see on the right, a number of parsing features. What's the role of this word in the sentence? We came up basically with 100 different features in addition to our 100 corpus statistics features. And we said, okay, each word in the story will be represented by a vector of these couple hundred features. And so based on that, she trained a machine learning model to predict from those 199 story features vector series to predict a series of fMRI data. There are some technical details you have to worry about given that fMRI is only imaging every 2 seconds in this case. So we had to, I'm not going to go into those technical details, but fundamentally the idea is given a time series of words represented by these 200-dimensional vectors, predict the time series of neural activity. So Layla trained such a model. Then she tested it by, again, showing it a new sequence of neural activity that it had never seen during training and asking it which of 2 story passages was the person reading. She found her model was successful enough that in 3 times out of 4 it could distinguish which of these two new story passages was being read based on the neural activity. And so then this led her to be able to show us which information about the story is being encoded where in the brain. And again, if you go back to the literature, there's plenty of work about where is there neural activity during reading. In fact, on this slide, you see a recent result about where neural activity exists during story reading. But with Layla's work, we're able to then say, where is different information about the story encoded? So where are the characters of the story encoded? Where is the syntax information about this role of the word in the sentence encoded? What about the semantics? What about dialogue between characters? The blue down here in the bottom, very interestingly, shows that a lot of neural activity encodes the fact that there's some kind of dialogue going on between two characters in the story. So furthermore, we can drill down on these things. For example, syntax is actually a kind of bundle of features out of the 200 that we have. So if you're interested in more detail on syntax, we can break it down into which aspects of the neural activity code say the part of speech of the word. Is it a noun or a verb? Versus which of them correspond to the sentence length or the parsing structure, the dependency role in the dependency parse. So again, the point is we're starting to be able to use these machine learning methods to decode neural activity in ways that give us really a new kind of methodology for even studying the question of how brains comprehend language. So let me go to my conclusion, because I want to have plenty of time for a discussion here. What are the lessons of this? I think there are lessons both in the area of neuroscience and lessons for machine learning as well. In the area of neuroscience, some of the things that have come out of this are we now understand that the neural code for word meanings are very widely distributed across the brain. In fact, I didn't dwell on this, but we also know that for concrete nouns like table and hammer, much of that neural activity that codes the meaning of those words is actually grounded in sensory motor regions of the brain. So if I say, I'll say to you the word hammer, think about hammer. I just generated activity in premotor cortex of you, which is the same region that you would use if you were planning, if you had a hammer and you were planning to hit something with it. So that's what I mean by the statement that much of the neural activity that codes word meanings is grounded in the same sensory motor regions that you would use if you were to perceive or interact with these objects. We know that your neural code and mine are very similar. We said we could train a model on one person and use it successfully to decode what a second person was thinking. The neural code is built from more primitive semantic features. That's what several of these models are doing. And we know that it evolves over 400 milliseconds based on the high-speed millisecond by millisecond imaging and analyses that we've done. So we certainly don't know everything about how the brain comprehends language, but we know more than we did. And I think as a method, the combination of machine learning with neuroscience has a huge potential for the future. There are also lessons there. So in fact, in this brief talk, I didn't talk about all the different types of machine learning that we've used, but machine learning classifiers, regression, discovery of latent representations, language modeling are all things that we've used to benefit. But I just want to sort of end on what I think are two very big opportunities. So if anybody out there is looking for a good research project or a PhD thesis, one of the huge opportunities is develop some new machine learning methods that will enable us to simultaneously analyze data from many different people in many different experiments. We don't have those methods now, even though I have on my disk about 1,000 different data sets of different people doing different types of language-related activities while we're imaging them either with fMRI or MEG. Despite the fact that I have that data, I'm not smart enough myself to figure out yet how to build a machine learning method that consumes all of that data, simultaneously analyzes all of that data, build a general model of language processing that would explain and be constrained by all that different data. Instead, the field of neuroscience today is in this one experiment at a time mode, which has the problem that brains are very complicated, and from any single experiment, we just don't have enough data to estimate all of the parameters to characterize the real complexity of what the brain is doing. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there to boost the whole enterprise of trying to understand how brains perform cognitive functions if we can come up with corresponding machine learning methods that can train these cognitive models simultaneously from much data. The second big opportunity is let's build a program that actually understands, say, sentences and uses the information processing steps for that to predict the neural activity when a person reads and understands the same sentence. And in the area of computer vision, we're starting to see that people who study convolutional neural networks have been able to show that if we train a convolutional neural network to analyze an image, classify what are the items in the image, that convolutional neural network, the internal layers of it and the internal representations of it can be used to partially predict the neural activity in the human visual cortex brain when a person looks at the same image in the neural net. So I think that is the second huge opportunity, which is let's build AI programs that perform the same function as the brain and try to see what is the alignment between the internal representations and the internal computations of the AI program relative to the neural activity in the brain. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I want to hear and have a discussion about your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will just say from the over 100 questions that we received, and I'm sure we'll be receiving them more as you answer these, that once again, you found a very fertile topic that people found interesting. So first question, as I organize them here, is the data used in this study available for public use, for example, for research at other university?
Yes. In fact, if you go to, what's the easiest way to say this? Go to my homepage, go to my publications page, and go to the science article, which is mentioned here, the one that mentioned in the first half of the talk where we train the model to predict neural activity for words that we hadn't yet collected data on. The data that we trained that model on is up on the web, downloadable. So is some of the MEG data. So if you go to my publications page in that science article, you'll see a pointer to the downloadable data. And I'll also say that people have, the data is well enough documented that people have successfully downloaded it and published follow-on papers using the same data. And I'd love to see more of that happen. So if you have any problem getting your hands on the data, just shoot me an email, tom.mitchell@cmu.edu.
Thanks. We had dozens of questions regarding your experimental method, and in particular identifying subjects. Would you care to summarize once again the number of subjects, their background as far as ages, culture, languages, and once again, there was, how would you say, yes, interest in whether there were other languages besides Portuguese and English that you tried these experiments on, and would other languages that are not, if you will, Romanesque, and different grammar structures result in, have any interesting experimental results?
Okay, great. Most of our subjects are simply Carnegie Mellon College students. So it does include native English speakers. It includes non-native English speakers and people whose native language comes from all over the world. We only use right-handed people. That's because many left-handed people have language centers left lateralized or right lateralized instead of left lateralized. And we just didn't want to confuse our program needlessly. But these are basically college students from around the world. I do think that the question of individual variation and how your background and your culture influences the way you think about meaning, I think that is an interesting question. But to be honest, for me, once we found the great similarity across people, the top 5 questions I want to study that's not included in my top 5 questions at the moment, because I want to move on instead to studying how people compose word meanings and sentence meanings beyond. But it is an interesting question.
I agree. The next question, for words that have multiple meanings, are there simultaneous activations of different regions of the brain for multiple meanings? And what about ambiguous images?
Oh, that's an awesome question. We purposely avoided that in our studies, but it is a really interesting research question. But instead of going for that, we went out of our way to make sure that all of the words that we present to people are unambiguous. So we just avoided that question altogether. Maybe as we make more progress, we'll graduate to the point where we'll understand enough to study the question of polysemy, of multiple meanings, and how and when the brain uses context to resolve which meaning is correct. But we were afraid to go there so far.
Understood. Here's somewhat of an extraneous question, but interesting nonetheless, about how the brain reacts to listening to music as far as eliciting an emotion or changing the state of the brain. Has any experiments that you know of been dealing with, say, emotional music impact?
It's interesting. I don't do research on music myself, but I do know of some studies where people have put people in scanners and played music of different types. I'm not aware of whether they focus on emotional response, but I do believe that there's work out there, if I'm correct, showing that you can distinguish which of different melodies a person is thinking about based on the time series of neural activity, or which melody they're listening to. But I'm just not familiar enough to answer the question about emotional response.
Okay. Let's see. We are up to 126 questions now, and we have exactly run out of time. So I will just thank you once again for, wish we had more time to say that we could answer these questions, but once again, I'll just say thank you for your time, and for the attendees, don't forget that the discussion continues on the discourse page, which is open in your tab earlier. If you didn't see it, you can access now. And I'd like to thank Tom once again for the informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions. A special thanks to each of you for taking the time to attend and participate today. This webinar was recorded and will be available online in a few days at webinar.acm.org. You can find announcements on upcoming webinars and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and acm.org. Also, would you please fill out the quick survey, or you can suggest future topics or speakers. Who would you like to see? That should be on your screen in a moment. On behalf of ACM, Tom Mitchell, and myself, Will Trace, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in the future. This concludes the webinar.